Let's take you live to the Gold Coast. Clive Palmer has been speaking. Look, as usual, he's going through a wide range of topics. Of course, he had his coal mine disallowed by Labor, by the Minister, Tanya Plibersek. He's been speaking about COVID as well. Let's have a bit of a listen in.
And she didn't visit us, but she'd visited, and her successors visited her predecessors visited the Greens, the lobby groups and all that. But we've got men and women up there depending on their jobs and their livelihood, and we had to do what we could to help it. There will be action taken, but I can't really talk about that. I'm not the sort of person that doesn't do anything, as you probably realise from my history, right? But we have to have a lot of compassion for the people and the families in the coalfields, because the Labor Party says one thing, that they support coal, and they do things like this. And what's going to happen to our country? What's going to happen to the economy?
What was your initial reaction?
Well, I think it's par for the course for the Labor Party. They've got a minority control in the Senate. They've got to pacify the Greens. There's been deals done between the federal government and the Greens that if we smash Palmer and the coal in Queensland, you'll support our legislation going through. But we've seen one of the Greens resign this week from the Greens, and the balance of power now in the Senate rests in a different position. So our Senator in the Senate, Ralph Babbitt, plays an important role in the Prime Minister trying to get a majority in the Senate. I'm sure he'll pay for it.
We saw the Greens win 3 Brisbane electorates at the last election. Is this a case, do you think, of the Minister playing to what she perceives to be a new audience in Queensland?
Well, I think we're in a different situation. At the last election, I predicted very much before the election that interest rates would rise, that unemployment would increase, that the real estate costs would come down, our debt would blow out. I said all these things and everyone said I was mad. But that's what's happened, and so the people now realise that that's what they're facing. So I don't think the Greens will be holding any seats after the next election, because you've got to put bread and butter on the table. Things are getting hard for people. And in just 5 months' time, we're facing a situation where I think it's about 25% of all home loans in Australia come off fixed interest rates. And then you'll have massive mortgages and things like that. And the average man in the street will feel it. So I'm sure that'll change. But right now we've got to deal with the COVID emergency, which is still on. You've seen a situation in Australia where our death rate has increased by 18% in the last year, and that's about 18,000 Australians. Or it's the equivalent of one jumbo jet crashing every week, killing that many people in this country. Now, they say it's not the vaccines, but what else has happened in that period? That's why it's so important to listen to Dr. Peter McCulloch tonight at the Gold Coast, and Dr. Pierre Corey and John Leake, to understand what's happening internationally. Is this something that's just isolated in Australia, or is it happening in the United States? Is it happening in Europe? Is it happening right across the globe? They're the questions we want to ask. Any more questions for me?
Can I just ask the impact on the Great Barrier Reef? You're saying it would have had a positive impact, right?
Positive, absolutely. And the reality of this existing mines operating now, which are closer to the Barrier Reef than we are, is the government going to bring in legislation and close those mines down to be consistent? What's going to happen? That's a good question to ask the Minister. But generally, these are decisions that affect the whole community, affect our standard of living. Queensland is the world's biggest coal exporter. That's a reality. Are we going to close the coal industry down? Are 350,000 Queenslanders going to lose their livelihood? Are their children not being able to go to school? Are bankruptcies going to increase? Is demand going to spiral down? These are really, really serious questions for the community.
We saw a $60 billion hit to the Queensland tourism.
All right, we will leave Clive Palmer there and use comments on the Gold Coast. Look, he's obviously pretty fired up about the fact his coal mine has not been approved. Tanya Plibersek, the Environment Minister, making that call mainly on the biodiversity impacts on the surrounds, including on the Great Barrier Reef from sediment going there as well. Pledging this will make things harder for Labor in the Senate. Look, once upon a time he had a gaggle of senators, Clive Palmer. He has just one now, and I'm pretty sure in saying Ralph Babbitt hasn't so far proven crucial on legislation. Labor have enough other paths, as long as the Greens are on board with legislation, to get there without Clive Palmer's senator. So unlikely to wield that sort of influence, but he's certainly pledging to be as difficult as he can be. So that was him speaking there on the Gold Coast.